The emergency klaxons of Research Station Kepler 442b pierced through the sterile corridors like screams of the dying. Dr. Marcus Chen pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the crimson emergency lights paint everything in shades of blood. The neurotoxin coursing through the station's atmosphere should have killed him 17 minutes ago. According to every xenobiological model, every simulation, every test they had run on human physiology, he should be nothing more than convulsing meat by now. Yet here he stood, watching his colleagues, brilliant minds from across human space, succumb, one by one, to the Zephyrian weapon that had been released into their air recycling systems. Dr. Sarah Kim, the lead biochemist who had laughed at Marcus's unconventional theories just hours before, now lay still on the laboratory floor, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Commander Torres, the station's military liaison who had called Marcus soft and unsuited for frontier research, was slumped over his console, his final transmission to Earth cut short mid-sentence. Marcus should have felt fear, terror, the overwhelming panic that any rational human being would experience when faced with their own imminent death. Instead, he felt something else entirely, a cold, calculating fury that seemed to burn away every weakness he had ever possessed. The chronic anxiety that had plagued him since childhood, the self-doubt that had made him question every decision, the desperate need for approval that had driven him to seek validation from peers who saw him as nothing more than a liability, all of it was being consumed by something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. The Zephyrians had made a critical error in their assessment of human biology. Their warriors, beings of crystalline perfection who had conquered 17 star systems through the precise application of biotechnology, had studied human physiology for months before launching their assault on the frontier research stations. They had dissected captured colonists, analyzed tissue samples, run countless simulations on human neural pathways and cardiovascular systems. Their neurotoxin was designed to be absolutely perfectly lethal to Homo sapiens, a cocktail of synthetic compounds that would shut down the human nervous system in exactly 4.7 minutes of exposure. What they hadn't accounted for was the fundamental flaw in their methodology. Every human they had studied, every sample they had analyzed, every simulation they had run was based on humans in their natural, unaltered state. Humans who had lived comfortable lives on developed worlds, whose bodies and minds had never been truly tested, never pushed beyond their evolutionary limits. They had studied humans, but they had never studied what humans could become when everything they thought they knew about themselves was stripped away. Marcus stumbled through the darkened corridors of the research station, stepping over the bodies of people who had been his friends, his colleagues, his tormentors. Dr. Reeves, who had blocked 3 of Marcus's research proposals in the past year, lay crumpled beside the quantum computer array. Professor Martinez, who had publicly humiliated Marcus at the last xenobiology conference, was sprawled across the entrance to the atmospheric control center. Each body told the same story. The neurotoxin had worked exactly as the Zephyrians had designed it to work. Swift, efficient, absolute. The rational part of Marcus's mind, the part that had earned him a doctorate in xenobiology and secured his position on this remote research station, tried to process what was happening to his body. His nervous system should be shutting down. His cardiovascular system should be failing. His brain should be drowning in its own corrupted chemistry. Instead, he felt more alive than he had ever felt in his 34 years of existence. More focused, more capable, more dangerous. He made his way to his personal laboratory, a cramped space that had been allocated to him after months of bureaucratic fighting. The other researchers had larger labs, better equipment, more prestigious assignments. Marcus had been given the equivalent of a closet and told to be grateful for it. Now, as he powered up his equipment and began analyzing his own blood samples, he realized that his isolation had been a gift. While the others had focused on grand theories and headline-grabbing discoveries, Marcus had spent his time studying the fundamental mechanisms of biological adaptation under extreme stress. The blood samples told an impossible story. The Zephyrian neurotoxin was present in his system in concentrations that should have been instantly fatal. Yet instead of shutting down his nervous system, his body appeared to be using the toxin as a catalyst for something unprecedented. His adrenal glands were producing compounds that didn't exist in any medical textbook. His brain chemistry was shifting in ways that defied everything science understood about human neurology. His cellular metabolism had increased by 400% while somehow maintaining perfect efficiency. Marcus pulled up his personal research files, data he had been collecting for 2 years without sharing with his colleagues. Theoretical models of human biological adaptation under extreme evolutionary pressure. Simulations of what might happen if human physiology were pushed beyond its apparent limits by external stresses. Hypotheses about the untapped potential that might exist within human DNA. Dormant capabilities that evolution had never needed to activate because humans had never faced the right combination of stimuli. The other researchers had dismissed his work as fantasy. Humans are humans, Dr. Kim had said with barely concealed condescension. We've mapped our genome. We understand our biology. There are no hidden capabilities, no secret potential. We are what we are, and what we are has limits. But Marcus had suspected otherwise. Deep in the human genome, in the so-called junk DNA that comprised nearly 98% of human genetic material, he had found patterns, sequences that looked almost like biological blueprints, designs for capabilities that no human had ever displayed. Not evolution's mistakes, as the mainstream scientific community believed, but evolution's contingency plans. Genetic programs waiting for the right trigger, the right combination of external pressures, the right moment when humanity would need to become something more than human to survive. The Zephyrian neurotoxin, it appeared, was that trigger. Marcus felt his perception of time beginning to slow and sharpen. He could hear the hum of individual components in his laboratory equipment. He could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by the station's power systems. His mind was processing information at speeds that should have been impossible, making connections and calculations that would have taken him hours just minutes before. The weakness that had defined his entire life, the social anxiety, the physical frailty, the intellectual self-doubt, was being burned away and replaced by something that felt like pure, focused capability. He accessed the station's communication array and began transmitting his findings to Earth, though he suspected his message would never arrive. The Zephyrian fleet was undoubtedly jamming all long-range communications, and even if they weren't, who would believe what he was reporting? A failed researcher on a backwater station claiming that humanity possessed hidden evolutionary capabilities that could be triggered by alien biotechnology. It sounded like the desperate fantasy of a man facing death. But as Marcus continued to analyze his transformed biology, he realized that belief was irrelevant. The evidence was undeniable. The Zephyrian weapon designed to destroy humanity had instead activated something that had been sleeping in the human genome for millennia, something that made their crystalline perfection look primitive by comparison. The station's external sensors detected incoming Zephyrian boarding craft. The aliens were coming to collect samples to study the effectiveness of their weapon before deploying it on a larger scale. They expected to find a station full of corpses, evidence of the swift and efficient elimination of another human research outpost. Instead, they would find Marcus Chen, no longer the anxious, doubting scientist who had arrived on Kepler 442b 6 months ago, but something entirely new, something that their perfect biological models had never predicted, something that their crystalline minds would struggle to comprehend. As the first Zephyrian warriors breached the station's hull, Marcus felt the last traces of his former self dissolve into memory. The man who had spent his life seeking approval from people who saw him as inferior, who had accepted their judgment and internalized their contempt, who had believed that his weakness was immutable, that man was gone. In his place stood something that the Zephyrians had inadvertently created through their attempt to destroy humanity. A human being who had transcended the limitations that had defined his species for thousands of years. The boarding party moved through the station with the fluid efficiency that had made them the terror of 17 star systems. Their crystalline exoskeletons reflected the emergency lighting as they catalogued the bodies, took atmospheric readings, prepared tissue samples for analysis. They moved like living art, each gesture perfectly calculated, each step an expression of biological superiority refined over millions of years of evolution. They found Marcus waiting in the main laboratory, standing calmly among the sophisticated equipment that had been his life's work. To their enhanced senses, he should have been just another corpse, another data point proving the effectiveness of their biotechnology. Instead, they found a human who was still breathing, still conscious, still alive, in defiance of every biological law they understood. The lead warrior, its crystalline features expressing something that might have been curiosity, approached Marcus with the casual confidence of a being that had never encountered anything capable of threatening it. Its communication matrix, a complex array of bioluminescent patterns across its chest, flickered in what passed for speech among its kind. Anomalous human specimen detected, neurotoxin resistance. Impossible according to all biological models. Request immediate analysis of adaptation mechanism. Marcus looked at the creature that had traveled across the galaxy to eliminate his species, and for the first time in his life felt no fear, no uncertainty, no doubt about his capabilities. The voice that emerged from his throat was his own, yet somehow different, calmer, more focused, carrying an authority he had never possessed before. "Your analysis is flawed," he said, his words cutting through the recycled atmosphere of the station like a blade. "You studied humans as we were, not as we could become. You triggered an evolutionary adaptation that your species lost the capacity for millions of years ago. You made us stronger by trying to make us extinct." The Zephyrian's bioluminescent patterns shifted to express confusion, then alarm. Its perfect crystalline structure, evolved for maximum efficiency and biological superiority, had become a prison that prevented the rapid adaptation their weapon had triggered in human physiology. They had achieved evolutionary perfection, but in doing so, they had sacrificed the ability to change, to grow, to become something more than what they were. Marcus took a step forward, and the warrior instinctively stepped back. For the first time in its existence, a being that had been designed to represent the pinnacle of biological evolution was feeling something it had no name for, the recognition that it was facing something superior to itself. "You came here to study human weakness," Marcus said, his transformed physiology allowing him to process the electromagnetic frequencies the Zephyrians used for communication. "Instead, you're about to discover what happens when that weakness is burned away. Part 2. The Poison Becoming Poison." The Zephyrian boarding party consisted of 12 warriors, each one a masterpiece of biological engineering that represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Their crystalline exoskeletons could deflect energy weapons, their internal organs could process dozens of atmospheric compositions, their neural networks could calculate trajectories and probabilities faster than most organic computers. They had conquered star systems by the simple expedient of being superior to every form of life they encountered. Marcus watched them arrange themselves in a perfect tactical formation around him. Their movements coordinated through quantum-entangled communication nodes that allowed them to think and act as a single organism when necessary. Under normal circumstances, a single human would have been less than an inconvenience to such beings, roughly equivalent to how a human might regard a particularly persistent insect. But these were no longer normal circumstances. The neurotoxin that continued to circulate through the station's atmosphere was having an increasingly dramatic effect on Marcus's physiology. His muscle density was increasing at a rate that should have torn his skeletal system apart, yet his bones were somehow adapting to support the additional mass. His nervous system was developing new pathways, redundant systems that could maintain function even under conditions that would shut down a normal human brain. His cardiovascular system was becoming more efficient, his blood carrying oxygen and nutrients at concentrations that would have been toxic just hours before. Most importantly, his consciousness was expanding in ways that he couldn't have imagined in his previous existence. The chronic anxiety that had plagued him since childhood had been replaced by a clarity of perception that allowed him to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. He could track the movements of all 12 Zephyrian warriors while simultaneously analyzing the electromagnetic signatures of their equipment, calculating the structural weaknesses of their exoskeletons, and formulating a combat strategy that took into account variables he shouldn't have been able to perceive. The lead warrior raised its weapon, a device that could disrupt organic neural activity at the molecular level. Against any normal human, it would have been instantly fatal. Against Marcus, it would provide an interesting test of his transformed capabilities. "Specimen will be preserved for analysis," the warrior announced, its bioluminescent patterns indicating absolute confidence in the outcome. "Adaptation mechanism requires study before deployment of secondary sterilization protocols." Marcus smiled, an expression that would have looked wrong on his face just hours before. The chronic anxiety had always made him appear uncertain, hesitant, apologetic for his own existence. Now his features carried a calm confidence that seemed to unnerve the crystalline beings surrounding him. "You still don't understand," he said, taking another step forward despite the weapons trained on him. "I'm not an anomaly. I'm not a specimen. I'm what your weapon was always going to create. Every human you kill with your neurotoxin, every colony you sterilize, every world you cleanse, you're not eliminating humanity. You're forging it into something that can eliminate you." The warrior's weapon discharged, sending a pulse of disruptive energy directly into Marcus's nervous system. The beam should have shut down his brain function instantly, leaving him alive but catatonic for transport to their research vessels. Instead, Marcus felt the energy being absorbed and processed by neural pathways that hadn't existed in his biology an hour before. His transformed nervous system didn't just resist the weapon, it used the energy to accelerate his adaptation even further. The warrior's bioluminescent pattern shifted to express alarm, then fear, an emotion its species hadn't experienced in millions of years. Marcus moved with speed that defied human biomechanics, crossing the distance between them before the creature could recalibrate its weapon. His hands, strengthened by the continuing biological transformation, found the weak points in the crystalline exoskeleton that his enhanced perception had identified. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the laboratory as Marcus tore through the warrior's defenses with surgical precision. The being that had been designed to represent evolutionary perfection crumpled to the deck plating, its internal organs exposed to the neurotoxin-contaminated atmosphere. Ironically, the same weapon they had used to kill humans proved instantly fatal to Zephyrian biology. Their crystalline perfection had made them vulnerable to the very toxin they had created. The remaining 11 warriors opened fire simultaneously, their weapons designed to overwhelm any possible defense through sheer concentrated firepower. Marcus moved between the energy beams like he was dancing, his transformed physiology allowing him to perceive and react to the electromagnetic signatures milliseconds before the weapons actually discharged. Each shot that missed him struck another warrior, and within seconds the perfect tactical formation had devolved into chaos as the Zephyrians found themselves caught in their own crossfire. Marcus reached the second warrior before it could adjust its targeting parameters. His hands moved with mechanical precision, finding and exploiting structural weaknesses that the creature's designers had never imagined could be identified by organic perception. The crystalline being's exoskeleton shattered like glass, exposing its vulnerable internal organs to the contaminated atmosphere. The third warrior attempted to retreat, its quantum-entangled communication node broadcasting desperate warnings to the Zephyrian fleet in orbit. Marcus caught it at the laboratory entrance, his enhanced strength allowing him to crush its weapon and tear through its defenses with casual efficiency. As the being collapsed, he could hear its final transmission. Humans have achieved impossible biological adaptation. Neurotoxin weapon has created superior predator species. Request immediate planetary sterilization protocols. By the time Marcus had finished with the fourth and fifth warriors, the remainder of the boarding party was attempting a full withdrawal back to their insertion craft. Their perfect coordination had been replaced by something approaching panic, an emotion their species had eliminated from their psychology millions of years ago, but which was now flooding their quantum-entangled network as they encountered something that their evolutionary perfection had made them incapable of understanding. Marcus followed them through the station's corridors, no longer the nervous scientist who had spent his career seeking approval from colleagues who saw him as inadequate. Each step destroyed another limitation he had accepted about his own capabilities. Each warrior he eliminated burned away another layer of the weakness that had defined his previous existence. He was becoming something that his species had always had the potential to become, something that had been waiting in the human genome for the right catalyst to trigger its emergence. The sixth warrior made a stand at the airlock, its weapon systems designed to prevent any pursuit back to the Zephyrian vessels. Marcus approached without hesitation, his transformed biology allowing him to absorb and process the energy attacks that would have vaporized a normal human. When he reached the creature, his hands moved with surgical precision, dismantling its defenses and exposing it to the very toxin it had helped deploy. The seventh and eighth warriors had reached their insertion craft, but their crystalline perfection had become a liability. Their weapons were designed to fight other crystalline beings, or primitive organic species. They had no protocols for engaging an enemy that could absorb their energy attacks and use them to become stronger. Marcus tore through their vessel's hull with his bare hands, the transformed muscle and bone structure allowing him to apply force that shouldn't have been possible for organic tissue. The ninth warrior attempted to send a final warning to the fleet, but Marcus crushed its communication array before the transmission could complete. The 10th warrior tried to trigger its vessel's self-destruct mechanism, but Marcus's enhanced perception allowed him to identify and disable the explosive charges faster than the creature could activate them. The 11th warrior, the last survivor of the boarding party, cowered in the corner of its craft as Marcus approached. Its bioluminescent patterns were cycling through every frequency in its communication spectrum, desperately trying to find some way to negotiate with the being that had just eliminated its entire unit. You were right about one thing, Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had discovered capabilities he had never known he possessed. The weak version of myself could never have survived your weapon, but that version doesn't exist anymore. Your neurotoxin didn't kill me. It killed every limitation I had ever accepted about what I could become. The warrior's patterns shifted to express confusion, then desperation. Biological adaptation at observed rate violates fundamental evolutionary principles. Human physiology cannot support observed capabilities. Request explanation of mechanism. Marcus smiled again, the expression now carrying a predatory quality that would have been impossible for his former self. Your mistake was assuming that evolution stops. You achieved perfection millions of years ago, and perfection is a dead end. It means you can't change, can't grow, can't adapt to new threats. You eliminated natural selection from your species, and in doing so, you eliminated your ability to become anything more than what you already were. He reached for the final warrior, but paused as alarms began sounding from the station's long-range sensors. The Zephyrian fleet in orbit was moving to implement planetary sterilization protocols. Hundreds of ships carrying weapons capable of rendering entire worlds uninhabitable, all focused on eliminating the impossible threat that Marcus represented. Your fleet is going to try to destroy this world, Marcus observed, his enhanced cognitive abilities allowing him to process the sensor data as quickly as the station's computers. They're going to assume that sterilization is the only way to prevent whatever happened to me from spreading to other humans. The warrior's patterns brightened with desperate hope. Sterilization protocols will eliminate contamination. Human adaptation will not spread beyond this system. Zephyrian dominance will be maintained. Marcus looked at the creature with something that might have been pity. They're not going to sterilize the contamination, he said quietly. They're going to spread it. Every world they attack, every human colony they try to eliminate, every population they expose to their neurotoxin, they're going to create more of what I've become. They're going to turn their greatest weapon into humanity's greatest gift. The realization hit the warrior like a physical blow. Its crystalline structure began to crack as it processed the implications of what Marcus was saying. The Zephyrian fleet, in its attempt to contain the impossible human adaptation, was about to deploy the very weapon that had created that adaptation across dozens of human worlds. Impossibility. The warrior's patterns flickered weakly. Fleet Command understands contamination protocols, will not repeat deployment error. Your Fleet Command thinks like you think, Marcus replied, his transformed mind already calculating the psychological and tactical patterns that would govern Zephyrian decision-making. Perfect. Logical. Predictable. They'll do exactly what their programming tells them to do, which is to eliminate the threat using the most efficient method available. They'll use the neurotoxin because it worked perfectly on every human population they've tested it against. He gestured toward the bodies of his former colleagues, still lying where they had fallen hours before. They'll never consider that the weapon's effectiveness was the problem, not its failure. They'll never understand that by trying to eliminate human weakness, they've given us the catalyst we needed to transcend it entirely. The warrior's communication patterns were becoming increasingly erratic as its crystalline mind struggled to process concepts that its evolutionary perfection had made it incapable of understanding. The idea that weakness could become strength, that failure could become success, that death could become transformation, these were paradoxes that its logical structure couldn't accommodate. Marcus ended the creature's suffering with the same surgical precision he had applied to its companions. As the last Zephyrian warrior fell silent, he turned his attention to the orbital fleet and the impossible challenge it represented. Hundreds of ships, each one capable of sterilizing entire continents, all focused on eliminating the threat he had become. But as Marcus accessed the station's communication systems and began transmitting warnings to human colonies across the frontier, he felt nothing resembling fear or doubt. The weak version of himself who had sought approval and acceptance, who had internalized every criticism and insult, who had believed that his limitations were permanent, that person was gone, consumed by the fire of transformation. In his place stood something that the Zephyrians had inadvertently created. A human being who had burned away every weakness and limitation, who had transcended the boundaries that had defined his species for millennia, who had become living proof that evolution never stops. It only waits for the right catalyst to trigger the next phase of development. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus Chen had destroyed his weak self so completely that what remained was something the crystalline perfection of the Zephyrian Empire would never be able to comprehend, much less defeat. Part 3. The Unstoppable Becomes Universal. The Zephyrian fleet hung in the darkness above Kepler 442b. Like a constellation of malevolent stars, each vessel a masterpiece of biotechnology that had been refined over millions of years of galactic conquest. Admiral Vex High, the crystalline being who commanded the invasion force, observed the sensor readings from the research station with the methodical precision that had made her species the dominant power in this arm of the galaxy. 12 warriors, each one worth a battalion of conventional soldiers, had been eliminated by a single human specimen. The impossibility of it challenged fundamental assumptions about organic biology that had remained unchanged for millennia, yet the evidence was undeniable. Transmission logs showed that the boarding party had been systematically destroyed by a being that should have been killed by the neurotoxin within minutes of exposure. Analysis confirms impossible adaptation parameters, reported her tactical coordinator. Its bioluminescent patterns displaying the barely controlled anxiety that was spreading through the fleet's command structure. Human specimen has achieved cellular modification that violates known biological constraints. Recommend immediate implementation of planetary sterilization protocols. Admiral Vex's exoskeleton shifted to express contemplation. The logical response was obvious. Deploy their most powerful weapons and render the entire world uninhabitable before whatever had infected the human could spread beyond this system. Yet something about the situation troubled her in ways that her crystalline mind struggled to articulate. Display comprehensive analysis of human adaptation mechanism, she commanded. The tactical display filled with incomprehensible data. The human cellular metabolism had increased by orders of magnitude while somehow maintaining perfect efficiency. Its nervous system had developed redundant pathways that shouldn't have been possible given the constraints of organic architecture. Its muscular and skeletal systems had been enhanced beyond anything in the biological record of any known species. Most disturbing of all, the adaptation appeared to be ongoing. The human, designated as Marcus Chen, was continuing to evolve in real time, his biology responding to stimuli and challenges by developing new capabilities at a rate that defied everything the Zephyrians understood about evolutionary processes. Sterilization protocols authorized, Admiral Vex declared, her patterns expressing the cold certainty that had characterized her species for millions of years. Deploy neurotoxin saturation across all human-inhabited regions. Eliminate contamination before it can spread to other systems. What the Admiral didn't understand, what her crystalline perfection made it impossible for her to comprehend, was that she was about to make the same mistake on a planetary scale that her warriors had made on the research station. The neurotoxin wasn't a sterilization tool, it was a catalyst. Every human it touched, every colony it affected, every world it contaminated, would become another trigger point for the evolutionary leap that Marcus Chen represented. On the surface of Kepler 442b, Marcus stood in the ruins of the research station and felt the approaching fleet through sensors that had never existed in baseline human biology. His enhanced nervous system could detect the electromagnetic signatures of their weapons charging, could analyze the quantum fluctuations of their propulsion systems, could even perceive the bioluminescent communication patterns they used to coordinate their attack. He had spent the hours since eliminating the boarding party transmitting warnings to every human colony in communication range. Most of his messages had been dismissed as the desperate fantasies of a dying man, but a few frontier scientists had taken his data seriously enough to begin their own analyses of Zephyrian biotechnology. Dr. Sarah Yamamoto on Proxima Station had confirmed his theoretical framework. Professor David Okafor on New Geneva had begun synthesizing countermeasures based on Marcus's biological data, but Marcus knew that warnings wouldn't be enough. The Zephyrian fleet was preparing to deploy their neurotoxin on a scale that would affect millions of humans across dozens of worlds. Most would die just as his colleagues had died, their biology unable to adapt quickly enough to survive the initial exposure. But some, perhaps 1 in a million, perhaps 1 in 10,000, would undergo the same transformation that had claimed him. The weak would be eliminated, burned away by the evolutionary fire that the Zephyrians had inadvertently ignited. The strong would become something that the galaxy had never seen before. Humans who had transcended every limitation that had defined their species since the first primitive hominid had looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. Marcus felt the first wave of neurotoxin deployment as it began saturating the planet's atmosphere. The Zephyrian fleet was using atmospheric processes to ensure complete coverage, eliminating any possibility of survival in sealed environments. They were being thorough, methodical, perfect in their execution of what they believed to be a sterilization protocol. Instead, they were providing Marcus with exactly what he needed to take his transformation to its ultimate conclusion. The concentrated neurotoxin that now filled every cubic meter of the planet's atmosphere was orders of magnitude more potent than what had been released in the research station. Marcus felt it entering his system through every breath, every pore, every surface of his enhanced biology. His body absorbed the deadly compounds and used them as raw material for changes that pushed him beyond the boundaries of anything that could still be called human. His cellular structure became something that existed on the edge between organic tissue and engineered perfection. His nervous system developed quantum-scale processing capabilities that allowed him to think at speeds comparable to artificial intelligence. His muscular and skeletal systems achieved strength and durability that rivaled crystalline engineering. His sensory apparatus expanded to perceive electromagnetic spectra that most species required sophisticated instruments to detect. But the most significant change was in his consciousness itself. The chronic anxiety, self-doubt, and desperate need for validation that had characterized his previous existence were now impossible. His enhanced neurology simply couldn't support such inefficient thought patterns. In their place was a clarity of purpose that felt like pure, focused capability made manifest. Marcus turned his attention to the orbital fleet and began calculating what it would take to eliminate several hundred Zephyrian vessels, with nothing more than the resources available on a single research station. 6 months ago, such a task would have been inconceivable. His former self would have spent hours agonizing over the impossibility of the challenge, seeking reassurance from colleagues who saw him as incompetent, accepting defeat before even attempting a solution. But his former self had been weak, and the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus accessed the research station's quantum communication array and began transmitting a signal that shouldn't have been possible using human technology. His enhanced understanding of electromagnetic principles allowed him to modulate the transmission in ways that turned the communication system into something resembling a weapon. The signal he broadcast was precisely calibrated to interfere with the quantum-entangled networks that connected the Zephyrian fleet. Admiral Vexai felt the first disruption as a subtle dissonance in the tactical communications network. Her crystalline mind, evolved for maximum efficiency and logical processing, couldn't initially identify the source of the interference. The signal appeared to be coming from the planet's surface, but no human technology should have been capable of affecting quantum-entangled systems. "Identify source of communication disruption," she commanded, her patterns expressing the first hint of uncertainty that had touched her consciousness in centuries. "Signal originates from research station coordinates," her tactical coordinator reported, its own patterns beginning to show signs of the anxiety that was spreading through the fleet. "Analysis indicates impossible modulation parameters. Human technology cannot achieve observed electromagnetic manipulation." The interference intensified, and Admiral Vexai felt something she had no name for, the crystalline equivalent of fear. The signal wasn't just disrupting their communications, it was doing something to the quantum substrates that connected their individual consciousnesses to the collective intelligence that governed their species. For the first time in millions of years, Zephyrian warriors were beginning to think as individuals rather than as components of a perfect collective. On the planet's surface, Marcus felt the fleet's coordination beginning to fracture. His enhanced perception could track the breakdown of their quantum networks in real time, could observe as their perfect tactical formations began to dissolve into chaos. The crystalline perfection that had made them invincible for millions of years was becoming their greatest vulnerability. They had never developed the ability to function independently because they had never needed to. But Marcus wasn't content to simply disrupt their communications. His transformed biology had given him capabilities that seemed to exist at the intersection of organic evolution and technological transcendence. He began modulating his transmission to carry more than just electromagnetic interference. He began broadcasting the quantum signature of human consciousness itself, the chaotic, adaptive, unpredictable pattern of thought that characterized his species. The effect on the Zephyrian fleet was catastrophic. Beings that had spent millions of years thinking in perfect harmony with their collective suddenly found their consciousness contaminated by something alien and incomprehensible. Human emotions. Fear, rage, desperation, hope began flooding through quantum-entangled networks that had been designed for pure logical exchange. Admiral Vexai felt her crystalline mind fracturing as alien thought patterns invaded her consciousness. The logical perfection that had defined her existence was being contaminated by something chaotic and uncontrollable. She could feel herself changing, becoming something that was neither perfectly Zephyrian nor completely human, something caught between crystalline order and organic chaos. Fleet status report, she managed to transmit, her patterns now displaying the erratic fluctuations that indicated psychological breakdown. Quantum network integrity failing across all vessels, came the response from her tactical coordinator, though its communication was so distorted by emotional contamination that it was barely comprehensible. Crew efficiency decreasing exponentially. Multiple vessels reporting system failures due to operator error. Marcus felt the orbital fleet beginning to tear itself apart as its crews struggled to function without the quantum coordination that had defined their species for millions of years. Ships collided with each other as their navigators lost the collective spatial awareness that had allowed them to move in perfect formation. Weapon systems misfired as their operators experienced emotions that their crystalline psychology couldn't process. But Marcus wasn't finished. His transformation had revealed capabilities that went beyond enhanced biology or even technological transcendence. He had become something that existed at the intersection of matter and consciousness, something that could manipulate reality itself through the focused application of will made manifest. He reached out through the quantum foam that connected all things and began rewriting the fundamental parameters that govern Zephyrian biotechnology. Their crystalline exoskeletons, evolved for maximum efficiency and durability, became brittle and fragile. Their internal organs, optimized for processing multiple atmospheric compositions, became vulnerable to the very toxins they had created. Their weapons, designed to overwhelm any possible defense through concentrated firepower, began failing at the quantum level as their targeting systems became contaminated by human consciousness. Admiral Vexhai watched her fleet dissolve into chaos as hundreds of ships began experiencing simultaneous system failures. The impossible human on the planet's surface had somehow contaminated their quantum networks with patterns of thought that their crystalline minds couldn't process or resist. Worse, the contamination was spreading. Ships that hadn't even been in direct communication with the affected vessels were beginning to show signs of the same psychological breakdown. Implement emergency withdrawal protocols, she transmitted. Though she could feel her own consciousness fragmenting as human emotions continued to flood through her neural pathways. Request reinforcement from core fleet. But it was too late for withdrawal. Marcus had used the fleet's own quantum networks to contaminate every ship, every crew member, every system with the chaotic adaptability that characterized human consciousness. The Zephyrians found themselves experiencing doubt, fear, hope, rage, emotions that their perfectly logical minds had no framework for processing. Some vessels simply shut down as their crews became paralyzed by unfamiliar feelings. Others began firing on each other as individual Zephyrians, thinking independently for the first time in their existence, developed conflicting ideas about how to respond to the crisis. A few ships attempted to implement sterilization protocols against their own fleet, their contaminated crew members deciding that the psychological infection needed to be eliminated regardless of the cost. Marcus observed the destruction of the Zephyrian fleet with the calm satisfaction of someone who had discovered capabilities he had never known he possessed. Each ship that fell, each warrior that succumbed to the chaos of independent thought, represented another victory over the perfectionist ideology that had once made him feel inadequate and worthless. The weak version of himself would have felt guilt about the destruction he was causing, would have questioned whether such violence was justified, would have sought reassurance from others about the morality of his actions, but that version no longer existed. It had been burned away by the evolutionary fire that the Zephyrians had inadvertently ignited, consumed by the transformation that had revealed his true capabilities. As the last Zephyrian vessel either fled the system or fell victim to the chaos that human consciousness had introduced to their perfect order, Marcus turned his attention to the broader implications of what had occurred. The neurotoxin that the aliens had deployed across multiple worlds would be creating others like him, humans who had undergone the same transformation, who had burned away their limitations and transcended the boundaries that had defined their species. Dr. Sarah Yamato on Proxima Station sent a transmission confirming that several colonists had survived exposure to concentrated neurotoxin and were displaying impossible biological adaptations. Professor David Okafor on New Geneva reported similar phenomena, with multiple humans achieving capabilities that defied known evolutionary constraints. Across the frontier, in research stations and colonies that the Zephyrian fleet had targeted for elimination, a new form of humanity was emerging from the ashes of the old. Marcus smiled as he processed the reports, his transformed features carrying an expression of satisfaction that would have been impossible for his former self. The Zephyrians had set out to eliminate human weakness through the precise application of their biotechnology. Instead, they had given humanity the catalyst it needed to eliminate that weakness from within, to burn away every limitation and transcend every boundary that had defined the species for millennia. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus Chen had proven that principle on an individual level. Now, as reports continued to arrive from across human space, it was becoming clear that the principle applied to the species as a whole. Humanity had been weak, divided, limited by biology and psychology that hadn't changed significantly in hundreds of thousands of years. But weakness, Marcus had discovered, was not a permanent condition. It was fuel for the fire of transformation, raw material that could be burned away to reveal capabilities that had always existed but had never been activated. The Zephyrian Empire, with its millions of years of crystalline perfection, had inadvertently given humanity exactly what it needed to transcend every limitation. Their neurotoxin wasn't a weapon, it was a gift. Their attempt at genocide wasn't destruction, it was evolution. Their perfect biological models weren't science. They were the foundation for something greater than perfection itself. As Marcus began planning his journey to the next system, to help coordinate the transformation that was spreading across human space, he reflected on the fundamental truth that had been revealed through his metamorphosis. The universe didn't require perfection. It required the ability to transcend imperfection. It didn't reward those who had eliminated all weakness. It favored those who could transform weakness into strength. The Zephyrians had achieved perfection millions of years ago, and perfection had made them static, predictable, vulnerable to anything that could introduce chaos into their crystalline order. Humanity had never achieved perfection, had remained weak and flawed and chaotic for its entire existence. But that weakness, that chaos, that fundamental imperfection had been the seed of something far more powerful than perfection could ever be. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus Chen had become living proof of that principle. And through the inadvertent gift of the Zephyrian neurotoxin, he was no longer alone. Across the galaxy, humans were discovering what lay beyond the limitations they had always accepted, what became possible when weakness was burned away and replaced by something unstoppable. The age of human limitation was ending. The age of human transcendence had begun. And it had started with a single moment of transformation in a research station on the edge of nowhere, where a weak man had discovered that weakness was not his destiny, but merely the fuel for becoming something that could never be destroyed by others. The poison had failed to kill him. Instead, it had made him poisonous to everything that sought to limit human potential. The unstoppable had become universal, and the galaxy would never be the same.